Okay, we talked about the Russian Revolution. That's in 1917. And then we have something that some people describe the second Russian Revolution, which is the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you should know the year, by the way, at least pretty close, that all of this really happened in the late 80s to early 90s. So the collapse in 1991. That's a year after Germany was reunified in 1990. And what happens during the collapse of the Soviet Union is that these other Soviet republics gain their independence. You have 15 new countries. The Russian Federation, what we just call Russia typically, and then you have a collection of Central Asian countries and new Eastern European countries and a few in Transcaucasia. Then we've talked before in Europe about centripetal and centrifugal forces, ones that pull countries together and ones that split them apart. And during the Soviet Union, they were kind of held together to Russia. But as the Russian economy got weak and the distance between the countries, as the countries wanted to become more, some of them wanted to become more aligned with the NATO or European Union countries, that was also forces that tend to pull them apart. So what we have in this era, we have the Russian Federation. Now, the Russian Federation is what we just call Russia today. It was a federal system like we talked about for the United States and Canada, where you have a mix of power between the the central federal government and the states. However, in recent times, it's started to change into a unitary system. Unitary is where the federal government holds all the power. And under Vladimir Putin, during the Putin era, he's been in charge of the country for a long time. He has really taken a lot of steps to centralize power in the federal government and reduce the power to local governments. So for example, governors of these territories used to be elected. Now he's changed to where they're appointed by him so that the governors are actually loyal to Putin rather than to the people in the state that elected them. So we have the Russian Federation and also the remaining 14 new countries. These are known by a term called the near abroad. So you have Russia and the near abroad. The near abroad are the former Soviet republics that have now gained their independence. And I want to kind of zoom in on Transcaucasia just to kind of highlight. So within Russia itself, you do have territories like Dagestan and Chechnya that are still part of Russia, but they have a limited amount of autonomy, but they are part of the Russian Federation. Then on the other side of the Caucasus Mountains, you have newly independent countries like Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. All three of these had been part of the Soviet Union, but when it collapsed, they gained some independence. And one thing you find with the Russian Federation more recently are policies of revanchism. Revanchism are policies that are meant to kind of regain some of the territory of the former Soviet Union. Now, particularly under Vladimir Putin, Putin has expressed opinion that the Soviet Union shouldn't have let all of these other territories go, and so there have been, overt or covertly policies that have been trying to kind of take back parts of the Soviet Union over time by the Russian Federation. So these are the near abroad countries. We can kind of put them in a few different buckets, and then we'll look at these separately. We have the Central Asian countries. We have the three in Transcaucasia. And then we have those in Eastern Europe, including these three what are called Baltic states. And we'll look at those a little more closely in a bit. All right, so the Soviet Union splits into 15 countries, the Russian Federation, and the 14 countries that are the near abroad. Now, some of those, but not all, Russia and 11, not all of them, form something that's sort of like the European Union, but it's called the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS. And I say not all because 3 of the former Soviet republics actually just go full European. They join NATO, they become part of the European Union, they're just kind of done with Russia being part of the Russia. And the post-Soviet, what was the Soviet Union. And those three are Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, what we call the Baltic countries. Those are not part of this CIS, they're part of the European Union. So these three, they joined the European Union and NATO. And we're going to come back and talk about those shortly. Now, just a little bit more about the population and economy in the post-Soviet era. When the Soviet Union collapses, you have a drop of support, financial support from the government for many of the common people. And whereas during the Soviet era, you had a high birth rate and low death rate, you actually have the opposite occur. You have now a high death rate and low birth rate. And this is called the Russian cross, where the two crossed each other. And the high death rate, higher amounts of poverty, alcoholism, and a number of other factors have kind of increased the death rate since the collapse of the Soviet Union. A lot of people were kind of left to fend for themselves. And you had a great deal of inequality in the country where you had people, a handful of people living in extreme wealth and a great number of people living in extreme poverty. So for example, if you look at the United States, if you look at the income categories of people, how many people are in the, low, middle, and high income categories, it's more evenly distributed in the United States, where in Russia, most of the people are in the really low category and very few are in that really high category. However, those very few people control a great deal of the country's wealth. Another thing about the population is that they have been leaving the Siberian part of Russia. So without the government supporting industry in that part of the country, a lot of people have been the population in the far eastern part of Russia, for example, the population has dropped by 20-something%, a little less, but the population has really declined in Siberia, and most of the people are kind of moving back to the European side.